If you want to understand tuples in Python, you have come to the right place. Now, if you don't have a fundamental understanding of basic data types in Python, I did release 2 previous videos in this series. The first video was basic data types. We covered integers, floats, booleans, and strings. And the second video, we covered the introduction to complex data types, which covered lists. In this video, we're focusing on tuples, and some of the content in this video does build on what we covered in those previous videos. So if you aren't familiar with those other topics, might not be a bad idea to go on ahead and hit the pause button right now and go back and watch those other videos first. Otherwise, like I said, if you want to know about tuples, you are in the right place. With all of my videos, I do release the Google Colab notebook in the description below. So there's a link, you can download the notebook, you can follow along as we do the exercises. And if you appreciate the video, please do not forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. I do release these videos weekly, and so you'll get that little notification as the new videos come out. Either way, if you like and subscribe, definitely helps out, so I appreciate that. And let's go on ahead and get started talking about tuples. Okay, before we get started, I just want to point out that there are 2 previous videos that we released covering Python data types. The first one covers basic data types, where we covered topics of booleans, integers, floats, and strings. And the second video is our introductory video to complex data types, where we cover lists. In today's video, we're going to talk about tuples, and the content in today's video does somewhat build on the content that we discussed in the previous videos. So if you haven't watched those yet, now might not be a bad time to pause this video and go back and watch those other videos. So, jumping to tuples. What is a tuple? A tuple is actually very similar to a list. However, tuples are immutable collections of elements, whereas lists are mutable. So basically what that means is once you create a tuple, you can't change it. Tuples, similar to lists, can store any type of data. So tuples can store integers, floats, and strings. Tuples can also store nested tuples and nested lists. Tuples are ordered, and tuples are created using parentheses, whereas lists are created using your square brackets. However, with tuples, the parentheses are not required, and I'll show you what I mean by that. And so, if tuples can't be changed, why would we want to use tuples over lists? And the answer is actually exactly that. Because tuples cannot be changed, the data that you insert into a tuple is essentially write protected immediately once that tuple is created. As long as you don't delete the tuple, that tuple is the integrity of the data contained in that tuple will always be maintained. Tuples also, because they are immutable, they present some computational simplicity compared to lists. And so if you have a list and you have a tuple and they contain essentially the exact same data, iterating through that tuple, because it is a fixed collection of elements, is actually going to be slightly faster than iterating through the exact same list. All right, so that's basically a summary of what tuples are and why you may or may not want to use tuples. Let's go on ahead and jump in to how to create a tuple and some of the other topics and examples we have for today. So when we create a tuple, like I said, we use the parentheses, and this tuple we're going to call my tuple, and we're going to create it using the parentheses. We have individual elements within the tuple here. Those elements are simply separated by commas, and each element in this tuple is basically just going to be a string. We're then going to print my tuple, and we're going to verify that the type of data that we just created is in fact a tuple. When we run that code, we'll see this is our tuple and that the data type is in fact a tuple. Now, like I said, in order to create a tuple, you don't have to use the parentheses. The parentheses are optional. And so if you wanted to, you can comment out this first line. There we go. And you can uncomment the third line. And then when you run this code, it's going to do the exact same thing. The parentheses are not required in order to create a tuple. Next, we're going to talk about indexing, and indexing on a tuple is identical to indexing on a list. So if you watched the list video, this is either going to be a recap, or you can skip through this section. But the first thing that you want to know about indexing is Python uses zero-based indexing. Basically, all that means is Python counts from 0 first. So it's always 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And that's important because when you are indexing on a list or indexing on a tuple, the element at index position 0 is always going to be the first element. The element at index position 1, that's going to be the second element. And then, so on and so forth. This would be index position 2. This would be index position 3. And so if we go on ahead and print that, we'll see that the element at index position 0 is eggs and the element at index position 1 is bacon. Next, we're going to go over a slightly more advanced example, and we're basically just going to create mytuple2, and mytuple2 is going to be created using two lists. So each of these lists represents its own element within mytuple2. So if we say mytuple2 element 0, that's referencing the first list. If we say mytuple2 element 1, that represents the second list. And then to call nested elements within these lists, we just add a second pair of brackets and we specify whichever index position we want to call, and that would reference the elements within the specific lists. We'll see that this code would return coffee and $8.99. Okay, next we're going to talk about mutability, and I wanted to spend a little bit of time here because this can get a little bit confusing, and I just wanted to try and explain it in a way that makes sense for you and is just digestible and in a way that you might understand it a little bit better than was explained to me when I was first learning about tuples. So tuples in and of themselves are immutable, and basically all that means is this tuple here has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 elements. We cannot add a sixth element, and we cannot delete any one of these individual elements to make it a 4-element tuple. This is a 5-element tuple, and it cannot be changed. However, mutable elements within a tuple can be changed. So tuples themselves are immutable, except for the mutable elements contained within tuples. All right, so what that means is, I'm going to give you an example. We're going to create mytuple3. Mytuple3 is actually comprised of 3 individual elements. So we have this string, we have this list, and then we have this nested tuple. And we know that from our previous video, lists are mutable. So lists can be changed. So like I said before, we can't delete any of these individual items to make it a 2-element tuple, and we can't add additional elements to make it a 4-element tuple. However, because lists are mutable, we are able to update this list that's contained within the tuple. So I'm going to go through this example, I'm going to run this code, and I'm going to explain basically what's happening. So first we create our tuple and we call it mytuple3, and then we print mytuple3. And then we print the element at index position 1 for mytuple3, and that is our list. And then we just get the data type for the element at position 0, the element at position 1, and the element at position 2. So eggs are a string, this is a list, and then this last element is a float. And so now, what if we wanted to try and delete this list? Let's go on ahead and give it a shot. We'll see what happens. We get a type error. Tuple object doesn't support item deletion, right? Like I said, tuples themselves are immutable. But what if we wanted to update our list? Let's say we wanted to delete an item from this list that is in our tuple. Well, we use the similar indexing that we referenced above, and we're going to say mytuple, we're going to say index position 1, and we're going to delete from index position 1 the element at position 0. So we're going to get rid of Walmart. And if we run that and then we print mytuple3 again, we'll see that mytuple3 started as with this list that had 3 elements, and after we delete Walmart, it now is a list that contains 2 elements. So I hope that made sense to you. You can't add or remove elements to a tuple once the tuple is created. But if the tuple has mutable elements within it, those mutable elements can be changed. Next, we're going to talk about packing and unpacking tuples. This is an interesting topic. And first off, I want to start by saying that packing a tuple is no different than just creating a tuple. So basically, we're taking these elements that are on the right side of our equal sign, and we're assigning them to the variable x. But tuples can be unpacked. And basically what that means is x is a 5-element tuple. And if we wanted to, we could take each of those 5 elements and assign them to their own individual variable. So we're basically going to take x, we're going to put it on the right side of our equal sign, and on the left side we're going to have the number of variables equivalent to the number of elements in our tuple. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 elements in our tuple. We just need 5 variables on the left-hand side of x, and then we can print the variables, and I can show you basically how that works. So first we create x, and then we're going to print a and e, and we'll see that a gets assigned the value of eggs, and e gets assigned the value of ice cream. So that's kind of cool. And then if we do type a, we can see that a is a string. So that tuple has now been unpacked and assigned the values a, b, c, d, and e for each individual element within that tuple. Another way that you can unpack tuples is by using the star args option. And this is kind of cool. It gives you a slightly different way that you can unpack tuples and manipulate your data. But basically, in this example, the first and last values are assigned to a and c. So a and c get the first and last values. And then everything in the middle is going to be assigned to the value of b. And then if we print a, b, and c, you'll see what that basically resolves to. So first value, eggs, gets assigned to a. Second value, well, first value is eggs. Last value is ice cream. And then everything in the middle is assigned to the value of b, which is kind of cool. So now we have a string, and if we check on what b is, we'll see that b is a list. Next, we're going to talk about concatenating and multiplying tuples, and this works identically to lists. So we're not going to spend a ton of time here, but I'm just going to give you a brief example. So in this example, we have tuple A, tuple B, and tuple C, and we're going to add those together, which is how you concatenate strings basically, and we're going to assign them to the tuple D. And what I wanted to show you here, more so than the concatenation, because we already covered that in the list video, it's working with singular element tuples. So A is assigned the tuple bits, but if we created A and we didn't have that trailing comma, A would actually just be a string. So in order for you to specify a single element tuple, it has to be created with the trailing comma. That is the same whether you use this format of tuple where we have excluded the parentheses, or this format of tuple where we have included the parentheses. Whichever method you use, a singular element tuple has to be created using the trailing comma. So that's a little hot tip for you, a little fun fact, something you can keep in your back pocket. If you're working with singular element tuples and you're getting some weird results, double check, make sure you included those trailing commas. If we run this, we'll see that D has become bits in bytes, and the type of data that we've created with D is a tuple. And then if we multiply our tuples, we're going to take D and we're going to multiply it by 2. We'll assign that to the new tuple of E, and then we'll print E, and we'll see that E is now just bits and bytes, bits and bytes. Next, we're going to cover off on the two different types of methods that are supported in tuples. And this is basically, it's going to be one of our first introductions to dot notation. But basically, a method is, it's kind of like a function. And so tuples support the count method and they support the index method. The count method will count how many times an element appears in your tuple. The index method will return the first index position that the element appears in your tuple. And so to use the count method, if we wanted to count how many times bits appears in tuple D, we specify tuple D, and then we do the dot or the period, so that's dot notation, and then count, and then the value. And then we would say tuple E, count, and then the value. And then if we wanted to see at what index in tuple E bytes first appears, it's basically the exact same dot notation. So if we run that, we're going to see that in tuple D, which is right here, bits appears 1 time, so its count is 1. If we check tuple E, which is bits and bytes, the count of bits is 2. It appears twice. And then if we check tuple E at what index position bytes first appears, we'll see that 0, 1, 2 bytes appears at index position 2. So those are the supported methods in tuples. All right, so if you've made it this far, congratulations. We are coming up on our final example in our tuple video, and boy, are you in for a treat. So in this example, I'm going to show you how to A, generate a bunch of random data, B, convert that data to a tuple, and then C, iterate over that tuple. And basically my goal for this example is to get 50 random names and congratulate them for completing their lesson today. To do that, we're going to install this names package. This names package basically lets us, one at a time, query random names from previous US Census Bureau data. So if we install the package and then we import the names package here, and then we call the get first name function, we'll see that it returns a random first name. If we run it again, it returns another random name, and another random name. If we kind of hover over it here, Google Colab will show us, some of the options that are available. So we can see get first name. We could specify gender here if we wanted a male or female name. We want both, so we're not going to specify anything. But yeah, that's basically how you get a random first name generated from this names package. So how do we get a bunch of those names generated? That's what I'm going to show you with this loop here. So we haven't really covered while loops yet, and that's okay. If all of this looks foreign to you right now, just give me a couple minutes, I'll explain to you what's happening here, and it's all going to make sense. I promise. All right, so what are we doing here? First, we're creating a variable I, and we're assigning it the value of 0. And then we're creating a list called myList, and it's just an empty list for now. And then what we're doing is we're going to loop through using myList and loop through using the value of I. And before we talk about how the while loop actually works, I want to talk about the meat of what's happening in the while loop. And so first things first, the value of I. Every time the loop runs, every time it iterates through, we're going to add 1 to the current value of I. So I starts off as 0. The first time the list runs, I becomes 1. The second time the loop runs, I becomes 2. The third time the loop runs, I becomes 3. And it's going to continue that way. Also, every time the loop runs, this little function is going to complete. And so we are saying myList append, which is a list method, first name. And so you might be saying, well, why are we using a list here when this video is about tuples? And the reason why is simply because tuples are not mutable. So you wouldn't be able to iteratively loop through a tuple and modify it as you go, appending new values. It's not possible. Once you create a tuple, the tuple is what the tuple is. So the way we get around that is we create a list, and then we're going to convert that list to a tuple. And all the append method does is it takes whatever value you're appending and it just adds it into your list. So if you had a grocery list and it was bacon, eggs, and cheese, and you wanted to add milk, append would just add milk onto that list. You're appending things to the end of your list. So all this is going to do is start off with our empty list, and every time the while loop runs, it's going to append a new name into that list. And then if we go up here to the while loop, we're saying while I is less than or equal to 50, do this and do this. So so while loops are a little bit different than for loops in that while loops basically have usually like a ceiling in this example. So it's going to run until we reach this value. And this value is the ceiling. So while I is less than or equal to 50, run through this loop. And so I, again, it's going to increase by the value of 1 each time it runs. And we're going to get a new name each time it runs, and that new name is going to be appended to our list. And what I'm actually going to do, so first I'm going to run this, and you'll see that my list, after we run it, is now a list of a bunch of names. So instead of just getting one name, we have a bunch of names. But so that that is, so that this is a little bit more digestible, a little bit easier to understand, I'm going to add these print functions or these print values to our loop. And basically what that's going to show you is each time the loop runs, it's going to show the value of I, and it's going to show you what my list represents in that current state. So let's go on ahead and run that, scroll all the way up, and we'll see that when we run the list the first time, or when we run the loop the first time, I starts off as 1, and we have 1 name. And then I becomes 2, and we have 2 names. I becomes 3, we have 3 names. And every time the while loop runs, I increases by the value of 1, and we add a new name to our list. Lastly, what we want to do is take my list and convert it to a tuple. And we're just going to, so this is all you have to do in order to do that. We take my list, we insert it into these parentheses with tuple on the outside. And all that does is basically convert my list to a tuple. And then we're assigning that to the tuple variable name t. And we're saying for name in t, print congratulations, print the name, and print you've completed the lesson.